suddenly, much new territory and many new stateless peoples who became slaves were tossed into the middle of the Roman Republic. And so by 130, 120, there were terrible constitutional problems exploding in Rome about a number of things, but take just one, landholding. There was a near revolution in 130 and 120 for about 10 years over the accumulation of huge territories of land in the hands of a few people. How had they acquired that land? Generals in armies who had acquired massive income, massive amounts of money, both territory and money, and could buy territory at home in Italy and could expand the territory they already had, and therefore eventually end up with tens of thousands of acres with total control in the hands of one or two people. So by 130, 120, there was great anger about this. Very similar to what South America's had for years and years and years. All vast tracts of Mexico owned by just one or two people. Same thing in El Salvador. So the problem of the concentration of land in very small numbers of hands were said to be dangerous for a republic, that you can't have that. You can't have just 1, 2, 3, 4 people owning territory like a whole state, because they might then throw their weight around against the republic. So that was one thing, landholding. And therefore, there was an attempt to introduce legislation that would redistribute land. It would compensate landowners, but of course, they didn't want compensation. They wanted the land. They had 20, 25,000 acres, and that's what they wanted. That's what their power came from. They had political power because they had 25,000 acres. They didn't want some money. They didn't want a pot of gold. That didn't do them any good. So 130, 120, 110, Rome was in crisis over landholding and the size of the holdings, and the lowest classes, and even the plebeian class, the middle class, which was the business class, even the plebeian class was furious at the power that was being concentrated in a few hands. Now, one of the people we talk about here tonight is going to be, and we will meet him in a moment, Marcus Crassus, C-R-A-S-S-U-S. He is going to be the richest man in all of Roman history, the richest man in the first century, the richest man we've ever known about in all of Roman history, a good friend of Pompey and a good friend of Caesar, Marcus Crassus, C-R-A-S-S-U-S. And how does he get rich? How does he get to be the richest man in Rome? Real estate development. Don't you love it? And now he had lots of other little tricks. One of my favorite was he started a private fire department. There was no public fire department in Rome. But Rome was building multi-level wooden buildings by the thousands as it grew, tenement buildings, dangerous tenement buildings, multi-story, maybe six-story wooden structures in the year 100 BC. Very, very, very incendiary, very, very likely to have fires. So Marcus Crassus started a private fire company. And when a fire started, he would appear out in front of your house with his fire department, and you would pay him right then the price that you felt it was worth paying. And you can imagine the prices people were willing to pay as the first story was going up, and there were still 5 to go. Now, isn't that brilliant? You own a fire department, and nobody else does. You've got the only fire. Nobody else has a fire. I know you're all going to say, why didn't Rome start a fire? Well, eventually they did. But not until after Marcus Crassus got to be very, very rich by going to the fires, selling his services, or if the building burned up before they could make a deal, he would buy the ruined building from the owner, you see, because now there would be the ashes. So his negotiators would appear immediately and would give them a good price for the ashes, and then he would build a new house. So pretty soon he owned half of Rome because, all the fires were going up, and he was buying out one after another. So we're talking about land, and we're talking about getting rich, and there's one person who got very, very rich. Now, there was other ways that you could acquire a lot of land or a lot of wealth, and the other way was, if you were a Roman general, a successful Roman general, then you conquered new territories. And when you did this, and a whole part of the Mediterranean would fall into your hands. Take Pompey, for example. He conquered Syria. He had a very good Roman army. He was a very good general. He was a very brilliant general. This is between 70 and 60 BC. So when he led his armies into a new state like the area of Syria, which had been governed before by the Persians and earlier than that the Egyptians, he would conquer successfully with very little resistance a whole state. So when he was finished, he had all of Syria, Iran, and Iraq under his control. Then he would go back to the now agonized and dispossessed owners of all the land in Syria, who were weeping and wailing in Damascus because now Roman troops were sitting all over their farms. And he would go to them and he would say, well, you know, I don't have time to run your great big huge Syrian agricultural company. I don't have time for that. And so what I would like to do is have someone here run it for me. Would you be interested? Now this is the former owner, you see, of the Syrian agricultural company. So the former owner would say, of course. So then Pompey would say, well, I'll lease it back to you. Now isn't that wonderful that you can lease someone something you just got yesterday? I mean, that your troops got. And so when he would leave Syria, for example, he would be receiving a lot of checks in the mail. He would be receiving a lot of money from that territory. Now, was he supposed to give the treasury something? Oh, yes, absolutely, and he did. But he could keep a lot for himself or his friends or his fellow generals or his lieutenant generals. All of them got a cut in this payoff, which was part of conquering new territory. So everybody got rich. Everybody got rich, except the Syrian agricultural company. They were most definitely not as rich as they'd been the week before, but they were happy that they had anything left. They were happy. They were back in their house, and even if they had to send a check off to Pompey every week, they didn't care because they had their house back. So what was happening in this conquest and this expansion of Rome was the creation of a lot of millionaires, mega buck millionaires, billionaires in our terminology now, and all of it very fast, almost overnight, in just decades. Suddenly Rome, the capital, where everybody wanted to live if they were an important Roman, was suddenly full of people who had more money than people had ever had anywhere ever before. And Crassus is the good example of it. He is richer than any Roman had ever been or will ever be again. And that includes Augustus, who will have his hands on the whole state, but his fortune. And it includes medieval kings. If you compare Crassus to a medieval king of England, you know, in 1160, Henry II. Henry II is a piddly little peasant compared to Crassus. That is, the worth of England, of all of what Henry had as King of England in 1160, isn't anything compared to what the worth of Rome was in 60 BC. Because Rome was so great, it was so rich, it had so many people. The population of Rome, remember now, in the time of Augustus, is going to move towards 1 million people. That's the biggest city anybody's ever seen at that time. So therefore, you had an enormously wealthy economic center of an enormously wealthy state within which were emerging a class of individuals who had land and gold and wealth and mineral wealth unlike anything any state had ever seen before. And what was going to happen? What was going to happen to that state? All of a sudden, everything in the state, everything in the republic was going to be under stress because of this wealth. This wealth was going to allow people to buy office, predictably. The wealth was going to allow people to buy offices, and so that is exactly what was going to happen in the first century. There were going to be a handful of individuals who would have infinite wealth and would acquire all the offices they could possibly want, and nobody would be able to stop them. Here are some maps, and here's one of the peninsula, the Italian peninsula, and it shows you the slow expansion from the little tiny core darkest red section, which is the actual city of Rome, and then the brighter red right around it, which is then the first Roman state, which would be growing by 600 BC and by 500 BC, and then soon increasing, including the Etruscan area, which is the gold part, and then further up there into the green, which gives you the Apennines and over the mountains and into the Po Valley. So that's one expansion, and that's going on down to, say, 200. And then the next big expansion, of course, is when the Roman state goes out of the Italian peninsula, which is yellow here on our map, and begins to expand around the edges of the Mediterranean, Dalmatia, Serbia, etc., and the south of France, and Sardinia and Sicily, the conquest of Carthaginians, so that's the green, the bright green, right opposite Sicily, and part of Spain, and then the rest of it was going to come into their control after 100. So then, of course, the next big section is the one that is Gaul and part of Germany and Hungary, which is, of course, thanks to Julius Caesar, and then also Britain. So those are the growth jumps from the peninsula to all of the Mediterranean, and then on. Now that's not the peak of the empire. The height of the Roman Empire is maybe Constantine at the year 300 AD. So that's still 300 years later. So that's the story of the conquest and the expansion and the growth of the power of both generals and just general wealth.